Today, I will discuss the French imperialism in Indochina. French imperialism in Indochina, which included present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was a significant chapter in the history of Southeast Asia. Before the arrival of the French, the region known as Indochina was a mix of distinct cultures, political entities, and religious influences. The region consists of present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, each with a unique historical background. Vietnam, for instance, had been shaped by Chinese influence for over a millennium, as it was ruled by China from 111 BCE to 938 CE. During this time, Confucianism, Chinese law, and culture had a significant impact on Vietnamese society. After gaining independence in the 10th century, Vietnam began to form its own dynastic structure, with the Ding and Lý dynasties leading the country. These dynasties, particularly during the 11th and 12th centuries, began to build the foundations of a strong Vietnamese state. During the late medieval period, Vietnam saw the rise of powerful kingdoms. One of the most important was the Dai Viet Kingdom, which controlled the northern region of Vietnam. In the south, the Champa Kingdom was an influential player, having established a rich culture and trade network. This dynamic environment made Indochina an important region for both local kingdoms and foreign powers, especially with its strategic position along the Southeast Asian trade routes. At the same time, Cambodia and Laos were also evolving into strong political entities with their own cultures and histories. Cambodia, once a part of the Khmer Empire, had seen its influence wane by the 15th century, while Laos remained fragmented into smaller kingdoms. By the 16th century, European powers began to show an interest in the wealth of Southeast Asia, and it was the Portuguese who first arrived in the region. The Portuguese set up trading posts and began introducing Christianity to the locals. However, it was the French, who arrived in the region in the 17th century that would have the most lasting impact on the region. French missionaries, particularly those associated with the Société des Missions Étrangères de Paris, were some of the earliest Europeans to enter Vietnam. These missionaries spread Catholicism and made their way into the royal courts, where their influence was often felt, particularly during the reign of Emperor Gia Long in the early 19th century. France's colonial ambitions began to take root in Indochina in the early 19th century, particularly after the rise of the Nguyen dynasty in Vietnam. Emperor Gia Long, who came to power in 1802, initially welcomed the French for their assistance in consolidating his power. However, the subsequent Vietnamese rulers, such as Minh Mong and Tu Duc, grew increasingly wary of French influence. The Vietnamese emperors, who adhered to Confucian ideals, saw Catholicism as a threat to traditional values, which led to the persecution of French missionaries and Vietnamese converts. This persecution set the stage for French military intervention in the region. The first major military engagement between the French and the Vietnamese occurred in 1858, when Napoleon III, seeking to protect Catholic missionaries in Vietnam, ordered a French naval expedition to attack the coastal city of Da Nang. The French forces, led by Admiral Charles Rigaud de Genouilly, initially had limited success in their efforts. They captured the city of Da Nang, but the Vietnamese were able to mount significant resistance. Nonetheless, the French were determined to expand their influence in the region, and they began a series of military campaigns to secure control. By 1859, the French shifted their focus to Saigon, which was strategically important as a major port city. After several months of fighting, the French captured Saigon in 1859, establishing a strong foothold in southern Vietnam. In 1862, the Treaty of Saigon was signed, forcing the Nguyen dynasty to cede the southern provinces of Cochinchina to France. This marked the beginning of the French colonization of Vietnam. In exchange for these territorial concessions, the French promised to protect the Vietnamese imperial family from further European interference. But this agreement did little to stem the growing tension between the French and the Vietnamese. While the French consolidated their control over Cochinchina, they turned their attention to northern Vietnam, particularly the Red River Delta. The French believed that this area, rich in natural resources and vital for trade with China, would strengthen their position in the region. The French forces faced resistance from Vietnamese forces and local militias, But by 1883, after a series of military campaigns, they had established control over both Annam, central Vietnam, and Tonkin, northern Vietnam. With the Treaty of Hue in 1883, the Vietnamese emperor officially recognized French protection over these regions, which made Vietnam a French protectorate. During this time, the French extended their colonial ambitions beyond Vietnam. In Cambodia, the political situation was unstable due to internal strife and the growing influence of neighboring Thailand and Vietnam. In 1863, King Norodom of Cambodia, seeking protection from Siamese, Thai dominance, accepted a French protectorate, and France assumed control of Cambodia's foreign affairs. While King Norodom remained as a figurehead, the French administration began to exert greater control over the region, paving the way for the eventual annexation of Cambodia into French Indochina. The French also had an eye on Laos, which was fragmented into smaller kingdoms and faced pressure from both Siam and Vietnam. By the 1890s, the French sought to bring Laos under their control as part of their broader strategy to control the entire Mekong River basin. In 1893, the Franco-Siamese War broke out, and France defeated Siam, forcing the country to cede Laos to French control. Laos was then incorporated into French Indochina, completing the French conquest of the region. By the late 19th century, France had established full control over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which collectively became known as French Indochina. The region was governed by a French-appointed governor-general who had authority over political, military, and economic matters. The French administration implemented significant infrastructure projects in the region, including the construction of railroads, roads, and ports, which were primarily aimed at facilitating trade and resource extraction for the benefit of the French Empire. However, the local populations, particularly in Vietnam, faced harsh labor conditions and exploitation, which led to widespread resentment. The French also sought to impose their culture, education system, and religion on the local population. Catholic missionaries continued their efforts to convert the indigenous people, though their success was limited. The French also established schools that taught the French language and culture, which created a small, educated elite who were loyal to the colonial administration. However, the majority of the population remained largely unaffected by French culture and continued to practice traditional religions such as Buddhism and indigenous animism. In Vietnam, the French influence sparked resistance movements, especially among intellectuals and the emerging middle class. The Can Vuong movement, which sought to restore the Vietnamese monarchy and expel the French, was one of the most prominent resistance efforts. This movement, which gained momentum in the late 19th century, was eventually suppressed by the French, but it laid the groundwork for future nationalist movements in Vietnam. The impact of French rule on the local economy was significant. The French focused on extracting natural resources, including rubber, tin, and rice, for export to Europe. The plantation system was expanded, and local peasants were often forced to work on plantations under harsh conditions. In addition to resource extraction, the French implemented a tax system that heavily burdened the local population, further exacerbating social inequality. The wealth generated from the colonies largely benefited the French, while the local populations remained impoverished. The French also introduced new technologies and industries to the region, but these developments were primarily designed to benefit French economic interests. While urban areas such as Hanoi, Saigon, and Phnom Penh saw some modernization, rural areas continued to suffer from poverty and underdevelopment. The gap between the colonial elite and the indigenous population widened, leading to social unrest.